Can you start out by telling us your name and giving us the spelling, please?
Sure, it's Sally Burnell, B as in boy, U-R-N as in Nancy, E-L-L.
And Sally, what's your connection to Kent State?
I'm a lifelong resident of Kent. We moved here in 1959 from Cleveland, where I was born. My father took a professorship here at Kent State, and then he died 2 years after we got here in a car accident, and we decided just to stay here because it was a great place to grow up. My mom realized that with 4 kids, it was a terrific town, and so we've been here ever since, just lifelong Kent resident, basically, except for the first 2 years of my life. So that's why I'm here.
And what was your experience surrounding May 4th?
Wow. Well, to start off with, Friday, was it Friday, May 1st? Yeah, wait, yeah. No, the 30th is when the riot happened, right? Downtown. It was either 30th or 1st. I had a little slumber party. I was in 7th grade, and my best friend and I just kind of had this little sleepover at my house and everything. And the next morning Saturday morning we'd heard there'd been this big riot downtown. So after she went home, we all walked downtown. I grew up 2 blocks from downtown Kent, so we walked downtown to see what was going on, and we saw all these shattered windows and everything, and we were just pretty stunned. But we figured, well, it's one night of mayhem, and it'll all be fine. They got it out of their system. Well, that was Saturday. Then Saturday evening, our neighbor Shirley Chegas called us, and she had a police scanner, and she said that the ROTC building had been set on fire. And so my siblings and I ran up to my younger sister's bedroom, which faced south, because we lived north of campus. And so I thought, well, if I look out that way, maybe I can see flames. So that's what we were all looking for. We all wanted to see flames. Well, we didn't see anything. So we had a neighbor, George Harrison, and he came over and he said that, he was going to try to go up to campus and try to calm the students down, because our neighborhood was a lot of professors and people affiliated with the university. So Dr. Harrison ran up to the university, and then he came back later on and he said, they're cutting the fire hoses, and there was nothing he could do. And so we just got, wow, it was pretty intense. And we thought, boy, So I don't remember if we heard whether the guard was being called in that night, and probably we did, because Shirley Chegas had a scanner. She knew everything. She would always call us and tell us this is going on, that going on. So the next day we woke up. It was Sunday morning, May 3rd. And so, yeah, Friday night must have been May 1st, that's right. So May 3rd, Sunday morning, we went to Mass at St. Patrick's Church. We were Catholic in the time. And we woke up to basically an occupied city. It was really surreal, waking up to, all these big armored personnel carriers and guys with, army fatigues and everything. It was just a very strange, odd experience. I never in my wildest dreams thought I'd wake up to an occupied city. It was just weird. So we went to Mass, and then as we were driving home from Mass, where the City Hall is now, Kent City Hall, that used to be a little store called Sparkle Market. And we used to drop by there on Sundays to just pick up, after Mass, we'd just pick up, bread, milk, stuff like that. We used to go through a lot. So we drove up to Sparkle, and we kids were in the car, and my mom was just going to run in for a couple of necessities. And we saw, across the street was the fire station. We saw all these cars pull up, limos and, press vehicles and all this kind of stuff. And the Governor Rhodes got out, and he, all these press people followed him to the fire station, and that's where he gave his famous, brown shirts and night rider speech, which we heard later in the day on television. And we were just mortified. We thought, oh, that great, just throw, gas on the flames, wonderful. That's just exactly what we're going to need. So later that afternoon, I was starting to feel pretty nervous, so I thought I'd take a little bit of a walk to, just walk off some nervous energy. Just because I was pretty tense about what was happening, and I wasn't sure where this was all going to go. So we lived, we lived like 2 blocks from campus, 2 blocks from downtown, and the elementary school where I had gone the year before, Walls Elementary School on Dormore, that was kind of being used as a kind of an impromptu military base. This is where some of the guards were stationed. So I thought I'd take a walk down there and just check it out, just to walk, just to go somewhere. I thought, well, I'll go on the playground, I'll swing, I'll ride the merry-go-round. I didn't realize it was a guard camp until I got there. I was very surprised. I thought, oh my goodness. So when I tried to gain entry to the front entrance of the school, this guard kind of met me with the bayonet, and I thought, oh, they're serious here. Well, we kids knew there was like this little wooded area behind back, and we knew all the ways to sneak back, into the playground areas. So, we just went back in there. And we ended up on the playground, and we just started talking to these guardsmen, on the merry-go-round and on the swings, and there was like a little stairwell that went up to this little street. I think it's called Burnell, and I ended up sitting on the stairwell with this one young guardman. So we got to talking, and he had, those big straps of bullets they were. I don't know what they're called, but anyway, this guy had like this big strap of bullets, and I was really curious because I'd never seen I'd never seen anything military in my life. I had no idea what that stuff looked like. So I asked him if I could see, is it real? I asked him, are those real bullets? He said, yeah. Can I see one? So he pulled one out and handed it to me, and put it in my hand. And I was really struck by, it was heavy. It was really heavy, and it was about as long as my middle finger. I was really stunned by the weight of this thing. I said, you're not gonna use this. And he said, well, right now he was ready to shoot anybody. I thought, God, I hope he doesn't, because these guys had just gotten off a trucker strike in Youngstown, so they'd been, pelted with rocks and probably shot at or whatever by angry Teamsters, and so they were exhausted. And I just remember thinking, I don't know if I like this. So I remember going home, and then later that night, these choppers started buzzing the town because I guess the students were, mustering. They were having, protests like on front campus and stuff. So we went up to my younger sister's room that faced south, and we watched the copters all night long, circling, because we were close enough to campus that they were like circling our house as well. And our Uncle Ed was, like one of the chopper pilots. So, we knew he was up there somewhere, and we just kept trying to wave to him and probably couldn't see us. But what was sort of really weird is we had this neighbor, we called him Fiddler. His name was Doug Rutherford. And he was a college student. He rented a little apartment from a neighbor a couple of doors down. And we called him Fiddler because, he was a fiddle player, folk musician. So he came, we were leaning out the window, we're looking down on everything, and Fiddler came down the street, and as we saw him going down Gatun Street, which we live on the corner of Gatun and Edgewood. It's where I grew up, don't live there anymore, but it's where my mom still is. And so he's coming down Gatun, and we kids were like, hi, Fiddler, and he went down the street. He talked to us for a couple of minutes. He had his fiddle in his case or anything. So off he went, and he was going to play some music to try to calm everybody down up in Tri-Towers, I think it was. So like a couple of minutes later, these two crew-cut neighbors of ours came running with baseball bats, and we were like, what? And they, where is he? They just saw this long-haired person with a fiddle case. They figured he probably had a gun or something, And we're like, no, where is he? Where's that long-haired hippie student? So they ran and they banged on my mom's door and told her, oh, don't worry, we're here to protect you. My mom's like, from what? And she was really puzzled by this. And so they I don't know, I think they eventually ran down to his, to where Fiddler's landlady was, and she was this big woman from Texas, and she sort of bawled him out and said, he's a student that runs from me, and go the heck away, and he's not doing any harm and everything. So they skulked back home and everything, being very apologetic. They stopped by my mom's house and apologized. So we just continued to watch the choppers all night. It was really, really hard to sleep because the choppers were, going all night long, and you just hear this, noise of those things over and over around our house. So we went to sleep with the sound of them, overhead all night long. So then the next morning we woke up and we thought, well, maybe they got it out of our system. It's Monday morning, back to school. Maybe it's over. Everything's calmed down. And so then the next day, we went to school like normal. And right after lunch, 7th period, I had this class in Ohio history, and I was in this classroom that was in the front of the building, and my row was against the windows, and you could see out, to the street. It was on this little sort of a Y, Whittier, Lowell, and I think it's Prospect, streets was where Davie Junior High is. And I remember looking out the window, and there were all these cars parked along the Y of Whittier and Lowell, which I thought was really strange because I thought, people don't normally park there. Wonder what's going on. It seemed something felt really wrong. And my one friend, Deb Griffith, her mother came to the door, and she looked real scared and worried, and she whispered something to the teacher, and then Deb got up and left with her mother. And I remember thinking, she didn't tell me at lunch that she's going anywhere, because my gal pals and I, we told each other everything like that. And I remember thinking, what's going on, And something in my gut thought, something doesn't seem right here. So it wasn't not more than a few minutes later. We were in the middle of taking a test that day, and a few minutes later, they came over the PA, the principal or vice principal or somebody came over the PA and said that there'd been some kind of shooting and that, there was 2 students and 2 guardsmen dead or something like this, and, that there were snipers everywhere, and be careful walking home. If you walk home in groups because there are snipers everywhere, and particularly if you cross Water Street. Well, I had to cross Water Street to get home. So school's out, dismissed, everyone to go home. So I finished my test, handed it to my teacher, rushed down to my locker, and then the first thing I did is I made a beeline to my sister's locker because I wanted to find her. I thought, well, we're just going to go home together. Well, I ran down to her locker downstairs. Well, I couldn't find her anywhere. I roamed up and down the halls, and I asked her friends, and they said, oh, she already left. So, of course, I, started sprinting home trying to find her, and I got into a group of people thinking, oh, good, safety in crowds, great, safety in numbers. Well, we got to a junction. We got to the junction of, I think it was Crane and Manawa. They went one way, and I went the other. I had to go across the Crane Avenue Bridge and, up Crane Avenue to go home. And here I was all alone. I ran across the bridge, and then I, ran as fast. I'd been a track runner, so I ran as fast as I could across the Water Street and started, sprinting up Crane Avenue until I eventually caught up with my sister. And then the 2 of us, just sprinted home. And our mom met us on the corner of our street and practically grabbed us by the scruff and, hauled us in the house and threw us in the house, slammed the door, don't leave this house. We thought, okay, well, what's going on? We'd never seen her that unglued. So she disappears. The 2 of us are going, what's going on here? And we went in the kitchen, and the kitchen was all upended, and the one drawer was kind of upended all over the kitchen floor. And my mom's like, neat freak, white glove clean. And this was not like my mother to leave a mess behind. So we thought, there's definitely something amiss here, So eventually she came home, sometime later, looking very rattled, and she had my 2 younger siblings in tow. She'd gone down to the grade school to get them out and to bring them home safely. And she, there's this woods kind of catty corner from my mom's house where we kids used to play growing up, and she cut through the woods, and there's a clearing where we used to, sled and play and everything. And at the time, my mom was about 42 years old at the time, and she looked very youthful. She had, long hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and she was wearing a sweatshirt and jeans and tennis shoes. And she said as she was going through the woods, into clearing, this chopper spotted her, running through the woods, and they thought she was a student, so they, tailed her, followed her. This chopper, followed her, thinking she was some student, running away. And so she eventually ducked into the woods and, lost the chopper, and then she ran to the school and got my sibs, and then she hitchhiked a ride home with some neighbors who dropped her at our house. And she came in the house, and she was really kind of unglued, and she had told us how she had a bunch of these helicopter pilots, like my uncle and a bunch of people over for lunch that day. And they heard all the sirens and thought, well, maybe it's just a brush fire or something, it happens this time of year. And then my mom, at this time, she had this old blue Volkswagen that had psychedelic flowers all over it. And so she drove my uncle up to the airport, and at the Kansas State Airport, and I guess they wouldn't let her leave, and she had to explain to me, I can't stay, I've got 4 kids back home, I've got to go home. So she eventually somehow found her way home by going, back roads, because by this time, Kent was sealed off. And so she somehow made her way home via back roads, got back to the house, and by this time, I guess we were all arriving home and everything. So the whole day was so crazy. My sister and I ran up to our bedrooms, and we got our little transistor radios to try to find out what was going on. And we were really just, wow, it was so weird. And so then that night, we really had no idea what happened until we turned on the 6:30 evening news with Walter Cronkite. I mean, it was if Walter said it, it's got to be true, because he was the most trusted voice in America. So that's how we found out exactly what happened, because you couldn't get any straight information. Nobody knew what happened. Nobody knew. I mean, you'd hear one person say one thing, you'd hear another person say another thing. I mean, there was no... It was just sheer panic. The whole town was a scene of utter pandemonium, because the students had been told dorms were locked down, they all had to leave. There was this mass exodus. It was just complete chaos. So we didn't have school for, I don't know, a day or two, something like that. I forget how long we were out. And then my older sister and I wore these black armbands with 4 on them to junior high school, and took such heat for that. We were nearly, we were given so much grief for that. I remember people calling me, all kinds of names and saying, oh, they should have shot them all, and, commie, pinko, blah, 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 blah. And it was just very, for somebody who, prided herself on being a relatively popular 13-year-old, that was really hurtful for me to, people who I thought were my friends were suddenly turning against me and calling me all these hateful, horrible names. Even teachers were, I thought I liked were, kind of glaring at me in a hateful way. And it was so hard for me to take that. it was so hard to have to deal with that. And then like the whole summer, the campus was sealed off. You couldn't set foot on it. And it was a campus, that was like our backyard playground. We played on the tennis courts and, rolled down the hills and, just took walks. And it was just a great thing. And we couldn't set foot on it all summer. So it was just kind of a weird summer, And so, eventually, of course, school started in the fall. And then I started KSU, 5 years later in fall of '75. And that was kind of a weird experience because everything was still kind of fresh after 5 years. And I got to meet Al Canfora and Dean Kaler at a little thing they were giving. I think it was like Manchester Hall or something. And it was kind of like, wow, And I told him about my experience with, holding this bullet. And, I've wondered for years and years and years, this sounds kind of morbid, call it the Irish in me. But I've always wondered, whether that one bullet I held that day, I've always wondered if that hit anybody like Dean or Ellen or any of the people I met later. Like I got to know Robbie and I got to know most of the students after I met him, pretty much all of them. And I've always wondered, did it kill somebody? Did it hurt somebody? Did the guy even fire it? Was he in a position to fire? It's kind of not worth beating your head up over that. It's something you think about from time to time. And so, it's just basically, as somebody who's a lifelong townie, I've lived with the kind of town gown tension, all these years. I'm an alumnus of Kent. I'm a lifelong Kent resident. I graduated from Kent in '79. I was part of the gym protests in '77, which was really, really fascinating because it was kind of almost a repeat, with the tear gas and the whole 9 yards and everything. And so, got to meet some really, really interesting people during that. And that was kind of as a result of, we got into the May 4th commemoration. And Ron Kovic gave this real, fire and brimstone speech and got us all, fired up. And so that's why we marched over to the president's office and had to sit in for I don't know how many hours. And we formed the May 4th coalition and we had all these demands, not build a gym and everything. We eventually lost that fight. But it was kind of a cool thing to be a part of that, to try to preserve something from my, teenage years. And so, that's kind of my story, more or less, really. It's been a part of my life for 40 years. It really it influenced me tremendously. My family's always been very anti-war. My family's always been, we've never been conservatives, hardly. We've always been flaming liberals, and we've always been very anti-war activists and stuff. But that really really influenced me to that there's a better way to solve things than to once you experience that, once war comes to your own town, you start to realize that war doesn't solve it. Shooting and killing and wounding, that doesn't do anything. And I even considered getting a major in peaceful change in college. I ended up majoring in theater, but I got to meet the people from the Center for Peaceful Change, and I was very moved by some of the things I experienced there. Dr. Dennis Carey and some of the other people who were part of that back in those days. And at the time, of course, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, but peaceful change sounded like a very interesting idea, and it's still something I'm a firm believer in, the idea of peaceful change, that change can be achieved, not at the point.
Okay, hold on. Sorry.
Technology, isn't it wonderful?
Makes everything easier.
So what do you think the sustaining impact is of what happened on May 4th, 1970?
Well, obviously, I think it was the main catalyst to end the war. Obviously, campuses all over the United States shut down after that. People were, they were pretty outraged that a bunch of unarmed students were fired on. And I think that was the primary thing that, at least from what I was observing, at that point I began to really be very observant of what was going on. And I would listen to the news and I followed it like a real fiend, and it was the beginning of the end. It was literally the beginning of the end. So I think it really served to end the war. But I wish there'd been a different way to end it. I wish it hadn't been so bloody and costly. That I wish poor people at Kent State hadn't had to pay with their lives to end it. That was not the way I would have liked to have seen it end. So when it finally did end, there was something kind of bittersweet about the whole thing. It came at a very high cost.
And why do you think it's important to remember Kent State today?
So we don't repeat the same mistakes. You know, it could be very easy in this time that we're living in now. You hear a lot of hateful rhetoric, you know, coming from, you know, all kinds of people, the Tea Party and all these other people, and you know, and it worries me because, you know, words, if misspoken or misused, can lead to violence. People have to be very careful how they choose their words. They have to be very deliberate in their speech. And, you know, when Governor Rhodes made that famous Night Riders in Brown Shirt speech the day before the shootings, that was basically pouring fuel in the fire. That was a huge indiscretion on his part. That was not the sort of thing that we needed. We needed healing words, not angry, hateful words. So we're living in an era where it's kind of dangerous right now because I'm hearing a lot of, you know, very hateful speech that could really, it could lead to something very bad if people aren't careful. So Kent State needs to be the lesson that words spoken at the wrong place and the wrong time by the wrong people can have a very powerful impact. Very, very powerful.
Who do you think is responsible for what happened?
Wow. There's a lot of blame to go around. I think there was an overreaction. I think calling in the National Guard was exactly the wrong reaction. You know, Mayor Satram, that was probably an overreaction on his part. Governor Rhodes, overreaction on his part. You know, everybody overreacted. People in power overreacted. The guardsmen, you know, I remember meeting the one fellow I spoke to, who I mentioned earlier, who gave me the bullet. He just seemed like a tired young kid who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were probably no older than the students that they were facing, most of them. They were just kids who were trying to get out of going to Vietnam by serving the Guard, most of them, really. I mean, some of them may have had a genuine antipathy, if that's the correct word, toward the students. But for the most part, I think they were just a bunch of scared kids and who were tired, who they were already exhausted. They'd come off, you know, a trucker strike with no rest. You know, if they were going to bring people in, they should have brought rested people in, and they should not have had live ammunition. That was completely wrong. They could have brought in maybe the state police or somebody, you know, or they could have found some other way to respond to this. So I think the people in authority ultimately are to blame because they way overreacted to what was going on. There was no need to bring in the National Guard. It wasn't that bad. I mean, you know, in fact, one of the things I forgot to mention is after Mass on Sunday, we drove up to campus to see the ruins of the ROTC building, which was all surrounded by, you know, like fences and stuff. We just saw this, you know, pile of smoldering ashes and stuff. And those were old barracks. They probably were going to get torn down eventually anyway, so it was no huge loss to the campus, really. And who knows? It's hard to say who burned those things down. Who knows? But yeah, I think, you know, if that one action was what prompted the calling of the Guard, please, that was an overreaction. The burning of the ROTC building, they could have handled that so much better. So ultimately, the people in authority, they were the ones that made the call, and they're the ones to blame ultimately in the end, I think.
What if there's anything else? Did I miss anything? Or is there anything missing in the story? Do you, what do you think needs to be done now to heal the wounds?
Well, I think that the thing that has to happen here is that the university has at least come a long way since I was a student in acknowledging what happened. And yeah, it's kind of hard. I've traveled all over the place. I've traveled, you know, from San Francisco to Miami to Boston. I've been all over the country and even to Europe. And when people ask you, well, where are you from? And you say, you know, from Kent, Ohio. And if they say Canton, I go, no, Kent State, May 4. And they go, oh, you know, there's this immediate recognition. And I think, oh gosh, you know, I hate to have to, I don't want us to be remembered for something bad that happened. It's so hard to say, oh, I'm from that place where, they shoot students, That's a very hard thing. But what would heal the wounds is just an acknowledgement by everybody that, yes, it happened, and finding ways to not only acknowledge it, but to acknowledge that there are better ways to prevent such things from ever happening again. The town and the university should address those sorts of things to prevent stuff from happening. Like just a year ago, I was at a picnic with friends down in it was Dover, I think it was, and I drove home that evening, and there was this big riot on College Street, the whole college fest thing, and I mean every cop car within a 50-mile radius was surrounding College Street. And I thought, oh, for heaven's sakes, here we go again, and once again, I think it was a real severe overreaction. I think, why does the city so badly overreact to this stuff? They're so afraid of the students. They need to find better ways of addressing this whole problem, and they shouldn't, come in like a bunch of stormtroopers like that. I mean, even on my street several years ago, there was a party down, several doors down from me where they brought in the SWAT teams and cracked heads open for nothing. And I thought, what is this? So it's just the city and the university need to acknowledge that there are much better ways to deal with these things. And there seems to be, there's always been a tension between Kent and the university. I see it as somebody I live in a university neighborhood, I live on University Drive, which is all, student rentals. And I'm so tired of hearing neighbors complain about the students. I mean, yeah, I get fed up with the broken glass and the beer bottles and things like that all over the lawn. It makes me nuts. But there needs to be, I think if the university and the city were to work closer hand in hand, so that the students don't have to feel like they're pariahs or whatever, I mean, there needs to be sort of a mutual respect between the two parties. And until that really happens, there's always going to be that kind of tension. I mean, what the city doesn't realize is that we have a symbiotic relationship with the university. We can't exist without them. They can't exist without us. And until they realize that, there is that natural symbiosis, that we've got to depend on each other. I mean, they're doing a better job of it now with the, downtown redevelopment and all that. That's great. They are coming around, but there's a long way to go before they really realize that there's got to be a better relationship with the student population. Otherwise, there's going to continue to be that tension forever, I think.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
You're very welcome. Very welcome. It's my pleasure, to tell my story and, share with you what I remember. It's been 40 years and, but the memories haven't dulled with time. Something like that you never forget. You just don't. It lives with you forever. It's like a bad dream, but you always know you're going to wake up from that one. And so, I hope that, other members of my family will eventually share their stories too, I think. Because they have things to say too.